You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Now, the controversial move to ban smoking in cars carrying children has won the backing of the Health Secretary. Jeremy Hunt says there's a compelling case for outlawing smoking when youngsters are in a vehicle. The House of Lords has backed a Labour plan to ban smoking in cars carrying children, despite opposition from the government. Labour peers tabled an amendment to the Children and Families Bill detailing their proposal for England, which they said was about protecting children. Ministers have argued that the new law, however, was a blunt instrument and that public information campaigns were preferable. Meanwhile, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, says he does not support a ban on smoking in cars carrying children in England, saying he did not want to subcontract parenthood. Well, is the state going too far? Most parents probably would not smoke in such an enclosed environment anyway, but does it need to be legislated for? And what does this actually mean about the state's involvement in what people do in public and private space? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk. Also here in the studio is Amanda Sanford, a research manager for ASH. And on the line, we're joined by Alan Stanton, a consultant paediatrician and a representative from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, and the journalist and broadcaster Rod Liddle. Rod, it's for the children, so we should support this, shouldn't we?
No, I don't think so. There's been a trend over the last 15 years, 15 to 20 years, of parenting being franchised out to the government. In a fairly unpleasant manner, there's been a sort of professionalisation of parenting, where it's been handed over to who we are told are experts, and increasingly, you see this not just obviously with smoking. I mean, smoking's just the sort of tip of the iceberg, or the thing which has come to our attention this week. That actually ordinary people aren't capable of bringing up children, that they don't know what the right thing to do with children is, and that therefore we need to have experts to tell them what to do and legislation to enforce it. And I think it's absolutely unnecessary. I don't know anyone who smokes in a car with kids. You know, I just have never seen anyone who does that. So it seems to me utterly superfluous and also a little insulting.
Alan Stanton, a little insulting. I mean, it's a bit like legislating against, I don't know, children playing with rattlesnakes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when you look at the effect that cigarette smoking actually has on children, obviously it's detrimental to their health to a very major degree, and we've got the figures that back that up. In this country alone, there's something like 9,500 extra hospital admissions because children are exposed to smoke, and 300,000 extra surgery visits. Something like 200 extra cases of bacterial meningitis. So kids are being exposed to smoke, and it's having a detrimental effect on their health. What's interesting is if you look at research that's been done on cotinine levels, which is a metabolite of nicotine, many parents who think they're not exposing their children to smoke actually get quite a nasty shock when cotinine levels in children's saliva are measured. And in fact, these children are quite heavily exposed to smoke, and it's a predictor of ill health in these children. So we haven't won the battle against children being exposed to smoke and the smoke having an adverse effect on their health. Professionalisation, franchising out of parenthood. I have to say I don't see this as particularly happening on the broader scale. There's lots more support for parents out there, most of which I think is very welcome. And certainly when I was a parent myself, there was a great deal that I had to learn, and I was grateful for some of the help and support that was there. And I'm a paediatrician, so I think that there's a strong case to be made for supporting parenthood, and when activities are actually damaging to children's health, for making that very clear, both through education campaigns and, where necessary, backing that up with legal enforcement.
Isn't it the point, though, Rod Liddle, that, as you say, I mean, the vast majority of parents wouldn't dream of smoking in such an enclosed space, but in fact, statistics suggest that something like 185,000 children a day are exposed to secondhand smoke, even if that's only a small percentage, maybe 5% of those in-car journeys. That's still a significant number.
Well, we don't know if it is 5%. I don't know who's done those studies or how true they are. I also wasn't aware that bacterial meningitis was caused by smoking, which is a new one to me.
It's not caused by smoking. I mean, the risk is increased by smoking. It's not the same thing. It's not caused by smoking, but we carry the bacterial meningitis germs in our nose, and the smoke breaks down the resistance, and it's therefore a factor which puts you at increased risk. It's caused by bacteria, of course.
Yes, indeed. So it's not caused by smoking. Right. I mean, it seems to me utterly ludicrous to object to the suggestion, the statement, that parenting has been franchised out. This isn't support for parents. This is the government telling parents how they have to bring up their children. And it's been going on for an awfully long time. If you read the works of people like Frank Furedi, you will see that it's been a continual litany since the early to mid 1990s that parents are considered not adequate to bring up their own children, and that therefore legislation and experts, in inverted commas, are brought in to tell them how to do so. And that's why I think that this is another facet of it. It's possibly a less unpleasant facet of it than some of the stuff which you see from our social services departments, which have taken this whole approach on board entirely fully. But it seems to me utterly unnecessary and, as I say, insulting to parents.
Can I just get your response to that, Alan, the libertarian view, or the view that this is an encroachment on personal freedoms rather than the health aspect?
Yes, I mean, clearly I don't want to debate the entirety of child safeguarding and social services actions thereof under this banner, or it would be a very long interview indeed. Yes, it's a restriction of personal liberties. Of course it is. The basis of liberties and rights is that you have the liberty, the right to do as you choose, so long as it's not damaging to other people. When those other people are children, I think that one has a stronger case for restricting liberties than might otherwise be the case.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the proposed ban for smoking in cars with children present, with Rod Liddell, Ian Dunt, Amanda Sanford and Alan Stanton. OK, well, look, Amanda Sanford, research manager at ASH. Alan there is making the point that it is an infringement on personal liberties to a certain extent, notwithstanding the health statistics of what kind of effect or impact negative thereof it has on children. What do you make of that, and where would you stop? I mean, what would you like to see ultimately? This is a personal space. You could say that the car is an extension of the home. In fact, would you like to see smoking bans in homes?
Well, on the issue of liberties and so on, I mean, I think I would agree with Professor Stanton that, to a certain extent, we are saying that it's inappropriate and wrong to smoke in a certain situation, in this case in a car where children are present. But I think it is justified to have certain restrictions on liberties when health is at stake, and particularly if it's the health of children, because they have little choice over where they are. If they're told they've got to go on a journey and get in the car, they have to do that, whereas adults at least have a bit more choice in the matter. And as for the issue of personal space, it's true that obviously cars are privately owned, but there are already other restrictions on what you can and cannot do in a car. We have to, by law, wear seatbelts. Now, there was some resistance to that when that law first came into being, but eventually people complied with it because they could understand the importance of it to protect not only their own health, but their own safety, but the safety of others. So I think it is justified in certain circumstances to have measures in place that protect public health.
Ian, what do you make of that? I mean, also there are restrictions on cars that are used for business, rental cars and so on. This is just another step.
I think you're in a very different place when it's a car that's used for business, and that was actually included, as I understand it, in the original legislation banning smoking in public places. So it's a bit like having a B&B and not allowing gay people, and it's no longer your home, it's now a car that's used for business. So I think that's a very different question. There are also restrictions on what people can do in cars, but if you look at those restrictions, if you look at those rules, those are mostly to protect other drivers. For instance, drink driving is not just a danger to yourself, it's a danger to other drivers. Similarly with seatbelts, I mean, human bodies are very dangerous projectiles in the middle of a crash. So those both have arguments that are to do with other people. What we are seeing here is quite the coup, actually. This is actually the state coming into your private property and telling you what legal actions you may or may not do. So, of course, there is no moral distinction, and most sort of anti-smoking campaigners have struggled to make one over the last few days, between this and saying that a parent shouldn't be able to smoke in a house with a child. And, of course, as clear as daylight to anyone, that is exactly what the next requirement will be upon people, until eventually, there is no sense that the state is barred from coming onto your private property. We have invited it into our living rooms, and once there, the state will put its feet up and demand ever more powers, because that is the direction that state power always moves in.
I'd like to come in a sense to turn the argument round. Why would you not have measures in place to protect children? You talk about other people. Other people are involved in this case. We're talking about children, very vulnerable children who don't have much say in the matter. So, why would, by not having this measure, we're effectively allowing the status quo to continue, which effectively could mean that thousands of children continue to be exposed to second-hand
Well,
smoking.
I'm actually not convinced that any of the evidence has been made really showing that there is a massive impact on children's health in this country from people smoking in cars with their children, because all of the evidence that does exist is based on surveys. I mean, one of them comes from the British Lung Association. I don't really trust that. The other one comes from Forest, which is, supported by the tobacco industry. I don't really trust that. In terms of actual, trustworthy evidence, there's very, very little. And what I would ask is, what is the moral distinction then between saying that we're going to interfere in the name of a child's long-term health with smoking in a car, or saying that we're going to do it with diets? I mean, how about the parent that allows their kid to have McDonald's, 5-7 times a week, or lead a sedentary lifestyle? That is also extremely damaging for long-term health. So once I knew the moral distinction, perhaps I'd be more comfortable. But when I don't know the moral distinction, my hunch is that this is a gross intrusion on the principle that you have privacy in your own home, on your own property, from the mores of the state.
Alan, can you step in there?
Perhaps, yes, so perhaps at least part of that moral distinction might be that something like 86% of children, when surveyed, actually said they wanted a smoking ban in cars. I don't think you'll have the same response if we suggested banning McDonald's.
Well, unless we're going to start forming legislation on what children want, and that doesn't seem like a very valid argument.
We've swooped from the legislative from the moral to the legislative here. The point is that children actually do like eating McDonald's. They actually enjoy these things. This is something they do that they're doing by their own choice, whereas being exposed to smoke is something that they do not have a choice of. And
yes, but if we allowed children to make the laws, they would surely decide that the entirety of their school day should be made designing robots. I mean, it doesn't mean anything, the fact that children happen to prefer it.
Rod, can you step in there, please?
Yes, I mean, it's an utterly ludicrous argument. I mean, firstly, I wouldn't trust a survey of children as to whether they wish for legislation or not. I suspect that most children would wish to have their parents locked up every now and again for no particular good reason. I mean, it's an absurd statement. But it's more than that. It's absolutely right. There is no moral distinction between saying you can't smoke in cars if you have children there and you can't smoke in homes if you have children there. And it's absolutely right to say, it seems to me, that will be the very next step that Ash, for example, will take.
Well, no, it wouldn't.
Amanda, will that be the next step you will take?
No, it wouldn't at all. And neither does the government intend to interfere with smoking in the home either. They've made that perfectly clear.
Or happy for people to smoke in the home.
Well, I didn't say that at all, but what we're talking about here is protecting children in a place where the law can be applied, which is banning smoking in cars.
So just to be on the record, because this will be useful for the future, you would oppose any legislation anywhere down the line which attempted to restrict the rights of people to smoke tobacco in homes where there are children.
We have it's not in our policy agenda to do that. But as I say, the issue here at the moment.
What I said, but
well, in fact, it is. We have no plans to do that. No, and neither has the government. But what we are talking about in the car is a different situation.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's been a gradual progression with Ash. Firstly, for banning smoking in parts of pubs, banning smoking entirely in pubs and restaurants, banning smoking within 100
and for good
yards
reason.
It's been a continual accretion of interference from Ash, and now supporting banning smoking in cars. So you have at every possible stage expanded your war against smoking. Fair enough, you think smoking is the greatest evil that the world has ever seen, and you wish to ban it. But it seems to me, from that progression, that it is inevitable that one of these days you will be saying that smoking should be banned in the house, because there is no moral difference between that and saying banning it in a car.
Perhaps it would help if I just explain what our mission actually is to reduce and hopefully to eliminate the harm caused by tobacco. So to that extent, our ideal scenario would be that no one is exposed to tobacco smoke in any situation. But that's quite different from saying that we're advocating a ban at this stage in smoking in the home.
But I think the point.
Yes.
But I think the point Rod is making is that, say, it has been incremental, and so in 2007 we had the ban on smoking in pubs, and now perhaps back then your vision wasn't necessarily to see a ban in cars at that point, but 6-7 years on, here we have it, and who knows what's going to happen in another 6 or 7 years' time.
Well, I think what will happen in the future is that more people will still have a nicotine issue, if you like. People will be using nicotine, but in the future from other clean sources other than from tobacco. So the whole issue of exposure to tobacco smoke will decline in time. But I think, just going back to the ban on smoking in public places, of course that was not only one of the most significant public health measures that's ever been passed in this country and other countries, but it had huge popular support. And things do change over time. And yes, there may not have been the support for a ban on smoking cars then, but there certainly is now. And the vast majority of the public are in favour of the measure.
With the greatest respect, the last opinion poll I saw suggested that somewhere in the region of 40, almost 50% of people thought that there should be areas in pubs where people were allowed to smoke.
Well, I don't know what the source of that survey is, but I suspect it's probably a tobacco industry-funded one.
I don't think it was. But, anyway.
But anyway, that's not going to happen because the actual ban on smoking in public places has been hugely successful.
And is established. Just on the point of how on earth this will be implemented, and how do you see it happening? I mean, whatever the evidence is, and let's say it does get through, and there will be a free vote on this, a car travelling at 30 miles an hour, how on earth can you tell whether a child is in the back, victim of passive smoking? I mean, do you think this has been suitably thought through?
I mean, there's clearly some careful thinking that needs to be done. I know that, just for one example, in the state of Oregon, they've made the decision that nobody will be pulled over for smoking with a child in the car, but if you're pulled over for some other offence and found to be smoking with a child in the car, that's when the law would be brought into force. That might be a sort of suitable compromise approach.
Ian Dunt, what do you think about that?
Actually, of all the arguments against this, one of the only ones I don't support is the idea that it's going to be very hard to police. I actually don't think it will be that difficult to police. The main reason for that is because Britain's a very advanced liberal democracy. Typically speaking, when you pass a law in this country, people do actually tend to follow it. And really what we'll have is an internalisation of the thought process around it. And actually, I don't think it will be broken. I think that process is made considerably easier by the fact that I think it frankly happens very little anyway, raising questions as to why the legislation should be taking place at all. But enforceability, I think if you can enforce a ban on smoking in public places, you can do it in the car.
Rod, government backbenchers won't be pressed to reverse the change in the Commons. There'll be effectively a free vote. Which way do you think they will go?
I don't know, if I'm absolutely honest. My guess at the moment, if the vote was taken in the next year, my guess is that it would be very, very tight indeed. After the next election, if it were to be voted then I suspect it would go through quite easily. But if the Liberal Democrats are against it, there will be a hard rump of Tories who I suspect are against it as well. Labour would vote in favour, I would guess.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the proposed ban on smoking in cars with children present, with the journalist and broadcaster Rod Liddell, the consultant paediatrician Alan Stanton, and in the studio Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk, and Amanda Sanford, research manager at Action on Smoking and Health. Amanda, what do you think? There has been, 5 American states have brought this in. There are countries like Australia, Canada, Cyprus who also have similar sorts of, or moving towards similar sorts of bans. Have you looked at the evidence of what's happened in those places? And has it actually resulted in safer environments for children, in your view?
My understanding is that it has resulted in safer environments, and that, as Ian was suggesting, the law has generally been self-enforcing. I think what it does is it helps to reinforce the message about the health impacts. And although the issues about penalties and so on will still need to be resolved. What the government will be doing is looking at the experience from other countries to determine how best to bring in the regulations and and who's going to enforce it and so on. But I think it certainly seems to have worked pretty well in other countries in terms of protecting children.
Ian, it's worked in other places.
Yeah, the self-enforcing thing, you see, I think is actually part of the problem. Whereas really, what's being done is that this legislation is being passed to send a message. It's the idea that they've mistaken legislation for a press release. And in doing so, they have crippled fundamental moral and legal principles about the full extent of what the British state is entitled to do to its subjects. And for what? To send a message. So actually the internalisation argument, which, it's sort of useful to those who want to ban smoking in cars because of how it's able to be policed, actually speaks to what's really quite pernicious and dangerous about this kind of lawmaking.
If you can send a message, Rod, I guess you'd be in favour of just educational campaigns being sufficient to send that message.
I'm not even sure you need educational campaigns at the moment. I have no great objection to them apart from the money that's spent on them. Money could be spent on on something else within our beleaguered health service. But I think that the British people, by and large, are aware that smoking is bad for you, and they're also aware of, within a very confined space, of the pernicious effects of cigarette smoke. I think people are aware of that. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And this is one of the reasons why I object to this proposed legislation, which is that it is the thin end of the wedge, and that it will continue and continue and continue until the state is intruding into our private, well, it will be intruding into our private lives.
Rod, can I just ask you, I mean, how does this issue compare with the U-turn on a change in cigarette packaging as well? There's evidence that would have an impact on public health, yet that hasn't gone through. It's going to be discussed again this week. Do you see a kind of hypocrisy there? What do you make of it?
I don't really see a hypocrisy there. I'm glad that they turned back on the issue of tobacco labelling. I wish they would also turn back on the displays of cigarettes in shops, because the present situation is just absurd. You are not allowed to look to see where your cigarettes are, the ones that you wish to buy. The poor woman who is serving you has to guess where they are. She's not allowed to open them up and look for them herself. I mean, it is an absurdity. Clearly, the effect of heavy-handed government.
The effect of heavy-handed government, Amanda. There.
Again,
on the cigarette packaging issue, where will it stop? This is a clear revenue generator for the government, yet there's no clear evidence that this has actually had any kind of impact on public health positively.
There is, of course, at the moment only one country that has introduced plain standard packaging, and that's Australia. And the evidence is growing there to show that it is effective in deterring youngsters from taking up the habit, and also actually helping smokers to quit.
Has it cut smoking rates though?
Well, it's only been in place for a year, less than a year, so it's a bit too early to say just yet. But what we do know is that the promotional features of cigarette packaging is just an extension of the advertising, which makes smoking look cool. It's what children are attracted to. It makes them more likely to want to smoke. So that's the same. In the same way, the point of the sale of display of cigarettes as well is another way of promoting those brands. So having them behind, putting them out of sight, is another way of helping denormalise smoking and making it literally putting it out of the mind of children.
Ian, politically significant, do you think? I mean, is this a war against tobacco? Plain packaging on the horizon, ban on smoking in cars?
Oh, we've been experiencing a war against tobacco for some time now, for well over a decade. It's highly significant, really, and I think you sort of speak to why, which is this process of denormalisation, which is a precursor to the final act of just banning cigarettes. Now, the question that I always really have for anti-smoking campaigners is, why not? Why so much cowardice? Why not just have the argument for banning cigarettes? Instead, we've seen this very smart campaigning over decades of chipping away at this argument, then the next argument, smoking in public places, then plain packs, then smoking in the car with kids, then smoking in the home with kids, because they realise that's the way to lay the ground for, as you say, denormalisation, and then they go for the ban. So if they want to have a ban, let's have the debate and decide whether there's going to be a ban, instead of this quite creepy step-by-step process that the anti-smoking lobby has been engaged in.
Well, I think you may well be having that debate before long, because there is sort of moves towards it's just been called nominally the end game of some countries already setting an agenda. So Scotland, Finland, Australia setting a sort of target for what's still being called either smoke-free or tobacco-free countries. So that is beginning to happen. But there is good reason for doing this sort of chipping away, as you call it, gradual approach, because it does help to bring the smoking rates down. Okay, it's gradual, but when we still have a situation like in this country where we have 10 million smokers, we're not going to criminalise them overnight and say, right, you can't have those cigarettes. It's would not be a sensible thing to do.
You're going to criminalise them over several nights.
Well, I mean, by banning smoking overnight, it wouldn't work, would it? There's no point in criminalising people for that. So the way of reducing
criminalising them anyway. I mean, it's something that an adult should be entitled to do. If they decide that they're willing to take the risk of a shorter lifespan for some small sensual pleasure, then perhaps they're entitled to have that.
If they want to do that, but do you really want to see children continuing to take up the habit? But bear in mind that most smokers, the vast majority, want to quit. Around around about 80% regret ever starting to smoke because it's so addictive and hard to quit. So surely,
we don't pass legislation for people's retrospective regrets.
No,
if we started doing that, then there'd be a host of other things that we have to ban.
So these measures that are in place are helping to make a society where smoking is not the norm. Children, fewer children take up the habit. Surely that's something that is beneficial. It's going to be a better society if we have less smoking in it.
I don't necessarily agree that that's a beneficial society. To me, a beneficial society is that adults make the choices that they have been educated enough to make about their own life, using the autonomy given to them by a free society. That may sometimes involve doing unhealthy things that sees them die earlier, but that to me is a definition of a good society.
Surely the fact that something around 2/3 of smokers say they want to quit and yet can't because they're so addicted to it suggests that some of their freedom to choose has been impaired by their addiction.
Rod Little, one day we could be having a debate about whether to criminalise smoking. This might be not too far in the distant future.
Well, you've asked Ash if it's not too far in the distant future. I dare say they will say exactly the same thing that they said about banning smoking in the home, which is it will be a downright lie. They will tell you that they have no plans to do this, and then within a few years' time, that's exactly what they will do, and it's been continual. And it's a deceit. It is a deceitful way of behaving. And as Ian says, have the debate now. If we should ban smoking, let's have a vote on it. Let's see if we should ban cigarettes entirely, and let's see if the British people do have the stomach to support what would be a sort of grotesque expression of nanny state interference.
That would be the ultimate goal for Ash, ultimately. I mean, you would be, in a generation's time, if you were the organisation that helped end smoking, which is what you consider anathema, that would be success for you.
As I said earlier, I mean, our mission statement is to eliminate the harm caused by tobacco. That's not the same as banning it overnight or banning it, banning the sale completely, but finding ways of discouraging use, encouraging people to quit. All that will continue, and meanwhile there will be work to continue to find less harmful ways of using nicotine, so that we at least get rid of the smoke, which causes the 100,000 deaths a year. That will be a major step forward.
Ian Dunt, it's got the backing of Jeremy Hunt. Nick Clegg has said he doesn't want to subcontract parenthood. Politically, this is quite divisive. It's a free vote. I mean, how do you see it will go, and what kind of implications will it have?
I'm pretty confident that it will pass. I think Rod's sort of basic calculations are right, but I think the numbers may be wrong. I think there is a core rump of Tory MPs that will oppose it. And I think probably actually on Lib Dems, you're going to look at about a 50-50 split there. Their political character and their assessments of these kind of issues is quite nuanced and complex. Nick Clegg is one side of it, but you do see Lib Dems express the other. Labour will vote en masse for a ban. And I think broadly speaking, if you look at that, you'll probably end up, it'll be pretty tight, but I think you'll end up seeing the legislation pass.
And how will you feel about that, Rod Little?
I'll move to Russia, probably.
And worth pointing out that Brunei, I think, is the only country where smoking is...
Bhutan.
No, Bhutan. Sorry, I've got my B countries wrong.
Smoke-free environment. They also have a happiness index in Bhutan. They were the first people to have the happiness index, which was impinged upon them by the Dragon King.
Maybe we could take a leaf out of their book on the happiness index at least. But anyway, many thanks for joining us. That's the journalist and broadcaster Rod Little. Also here in the studio, Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk. Amanda Sanford, research manager at ASH. The consultant paediatrician Alan Stanton. Many thanks for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London. You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Now, the controversial move to ban smoking in cars carrying children has won the backing of the Health Secretary. Jeremy Hunt says there's a compelling case for outlawing smoking when youngsters are in a vehicle. The House of Lords has backed a Labour plan to ban smoking in cars carrying children, despite opposition from the government. Labour peers tabled an amendment to the Children and Families Bill detailing their proposal for England, which they said was about protecting children. Ministers have argued that the new law, however, was a blunt instrument and that public information campaigns were preferable. Meanwhile, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, says he does not support a ban on smoking in cars carrying children in England, saying he did not want to subcontract parenthood. Well, is the state going too far? Most parents probably would not smoke in such an enclosed environment anyway, but does it need to be legislated for? And what does this actually mean about the state's involvement in what people do in public and private space? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk.
I wasn't aware that bacterial meningitis was caused by smoking, which is a new one to me.
It's not caused by smoking, the risk is increased by smoking. It's not the same thing. It's not caused by smoking, but we carry the bacterial meningitis germs in our nose, and the smoke breaks down the resistance, and it's therefore a factor which puts you at increased risk. It's caused by bacteria, of course.
Yes, indeed. So it's not caused by smoking. Right. I mean, it seems to be utterly ludicrous to object to the suggestion, the statement, that parenting has been franchised out. This isn't support for parents. This is the government telling parents how they have to bring up their children. And it's been going on for an awfully long time. If you read the works of people like Frank Furedi, you will see that it's been a continual litany since the early to mid 1990s that parents are considered not adequate to bring up their own children, and that therefore legislation and experts, in inverted commas, are brought in to tell them how to do so. And that's why I think that this is another facet of it. It's possibly a less unpleasant facet with kids. You know, I just have never seen anyone who does that. So it seems to me utterly superfluous and also a little insulting.
Alan Stanton, a little insulting. I mean, it's a bit like legislating against, I don't know, children playing with rattlesnakes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when you look at the effect that cigarette smoking actually has on children, obviously it's detrimental to their health to a very major degree, and we've got the figures that back that up. In this country alone, there's something like 9,500 extra hospital admissions because children are exposed to smoke, and 300,000 extra surgery visits. Something like 200 extra cases of bacterial meningitis. So kids are being exposed to smoke, and it's having a detrimental effect on their health. What's interesting is if you look at research that's been done on cotinine levels, which is a metabolite of nicotine, many parents who think they're not exposing their children to smoke actually get quite a nasty shock when cotinine levels in children's saliva are measured. And in fact, these children are quite heavily exposed to smoke, and it's a predictor of ill health in these children. So we haven't won the battle against children being exposed to smoke and the smoke having an adverse effect on their health. Professionalisation, franchising out of parenthood. I have to say I don't see this as particularly happening on the broader scale. There's lots more support for parents out there, most of which I think is very welcome. And certainly when I was a parent myself, there was a great deal that I had to learn, and I was grateful for some of the help and support that was there. And I'm a paediatrician, so I think that there's a strong case to be made for supporting parenthood, and when activities are actually damaging to children's health, for making that very clear, both through education campaigns and, where necessary, backing that up with legal enforcement.
Isn't it the point, though, Rod Liddle, that, as you say, I mean, the vast majority of parents wouldn't dream of smoking in such an enclosed space, but in fact, statistics suggest that something like 185,000 children a day are exposed to secondhand smoke, even if that's only a small percentage, maybe 5% of those in-car journeys. That's still a significant number.
Well, we don't know if it is 5%. I don't know who's done those studies or how true they are. Also here in the studio is Amanda Sanford, a research manager for ASH, and on the line we're joined by Alan Stanton, a consultant paediatrician and a representative from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, and the journalist and broadcaster Rod Liddle. Rod, it's for the children, so we should support this, shouldn't we? No, I don't think so. There's been a trend over the last 15 years, 15 to 20 years, of parenting being franchised out to the government. In a fairly unpleasant manner, there's been a sort of professionalisation of parenting, where it's been handed over to who we are told are experts, and increasingly, you see this not just obviously with smoking. I mean, smoking's just the sort of tip of the iceberg, or the thing which has come to our attention this week, that actually ordinary people aren't capable of bringing up children, that they don't know what the right thing to do with children is, and that therefore we need to have experts to tell them what to do and legislation to enforce it. And I think it's absolutely unnecessary. I don't know anyone who smokes in a car